Japan remained a medieval rural warrior society until the late 19th century, when it began developing rapidly into an industrial economy. Growing national self-confidence and aggressive foreign policy led to large-scale rearmament that would stimulate Japanese economy. Japan's 4 main islands lacked sufficient land to feed its growing population, and had also to import industrial raw materials such as steel and oil from the USA, rubber and bauxite from British Malaya. Japanese expansion and imperialism depended upon industries whose raw material supplies could be disrupted by Western trading sanctions. With most sources of supply under US, British and European control, Japan came to believe it was crucial these were made secure, if necessary through conquest. Both the US and Britain exercised Pacific control through powerful navies, and, as Japanese military strength increased, tried to prevent it building a competitive fleet. Now dangerous, resentful and aggressive, Japan began expanding in 1931 when it invaded Manchuria in mainland China. International condemnation of this act, together with US trade sanctions to curb such imperialism, caused even greater resentment. Soon, Japan would quit the League of Nations.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East.
Président, messieurs, c'est pour la délégation japonaise.
And by 1936 was being governed by a military dictatorship under the nominal leadership of its godlike emperor Hirohito. That same year, when US President Roosevelt stated, "Let no one imagine America will escape, that America may expect mercy, that this Western Hemisphere will not be attacked," his comments could be applied equally to threats both German and Japanese. In 1937, tensions between Japan and Western powers heightened further when it seized upon a flimsy excuse to declare war on China. Eventually, over a third of Chinese territory would be under Japanese control. By July that year, Britain and the USA, increasingly concerned over Japan's growing imperialism, began supporting the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek as counterbalance, even dispatching aid along the Burma Road. But Japanese forces proved not only irresistible but cruel, their seizure of Nanking, China's capital, in December 1937, being followed by several months of atrocities, during which an estimated 300,000 Chinese were slaughtered. This rape of Nanking resounded to Japan's discredit throughout the world, with even Germany's Nazi Party expressing horror. Tension, already high, rose when an isolated and dangerous Japan declared its intention of imposing its own new order by driving all Western powers out of Asia. To avoid trade sanctions that could cut its raw material supplies, Japan planned to create its own southern resource zone by seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Indonesia, and Burma. Protected by an outer ring of fortified islands and mainland, all would be secured by total Japanese sea and air control. By the late 1930s, modern warships, merchant vessels and aircraft had been designed and built in large numbers, and huge armies prepared for Pacific conquests. Opportunity first arose in September 1939, when the European War's outbreak concentrated Western powers' attention. Soon Britain and its Commonwealth fighting alone could do little to protect Pacific interests. Only the USA possessed industrial and military potential capable of frustrating Japanese intentions. But, in spite of Roosevelt's warnings, its isolationist attitude still prevailed. Even though Japan's modern navy was already almost on a par with US and British fleets combined, America remained confident its Pearl Harbor battleships could counter any threat. But on the 26th of September 1940, a Pacific War became inevitable when, in response to Japan's blockade of British and French interests in China, President Roosevelt gave Japan 6 months' notice of a steel embargo. In China, a puppet government is established at Nanking to rule Japan's conquered territories. Japan enters into an Axis tripartite alliance with Germany and Italy that provides freedom to pursue its New Order policy. Neither country has any particular Pacific interests, but see this as a way of weakening British and US influence in the region. Occupation of French Indochina is essential for Japan to seize control of Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands. With France defeated, Japan now enters into agreement with its puppy Vichy regime that provides free use of Indo-Chinese ports and airfields. Germany's 1941 attack on Russia removes any threat against Japan from that quarter and frees forces for Pacific conquest. With millions of men under arms and with modern and powerful naval and air forces, Japan now abandons diplomacy and adopts open war. During the year, with the aid of local anti-colonial movements, Burma is occupied, as are the Dutch East Indies, whose oil production is vital to Japan's war effort. The Second World War has now spread into the Pacific, and for the first time, Australia and New Zealand come under threat. With Britain's manufacturing base fully occupied with wartime demands, all its highly advanced nuclear research is handed over to the USA, accompanied by several of its leading scientists. A promise is received that any atomic weapons developed will not be employed without British consent. Aware that trade sanctions would cripple Japan within 2 years, General Tojo, now Japanese Prime Minister, decides upon simultaneous attacks on strategic areas throughout the region, especially the US Pearl Harbor and British Malaysia. Without any prior warning, Japanese bombers attacked Pearl Harbor, a major U.S. naval base in Hawaii, an event President Roosevelt describes as a day that will live in infamy. Eight battleships and 11 other naval vessels are sunk or disabled at their moorings, and 188 U.S. planes destroyed by aircraft flown off Japanese carriers. Although most of the U.S. Pacific Fleet is now put out of action by this one treacherous blow, significant is the fact it fails to locate 3 vital aircraft carriers then exercising at sea.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific.
In a few hours, Japan has acquired sea and air control that will enable it to invade and conquer almost unhindered throughout the Pacific for the next 6 months, during which its sphere of influence will reach a peak. With Pearl Harbor under attack, Japanese bombing raids are also mounted against targets in Shanghai, Thailand, Malaya, and Singapore. Japanese forces move against Hong Kong, a British colony on the Chinese mainland, but its small garrison resists fiercely. Japanese troops attack Malaya and Singapore from their newly acquired bases in Indochina and Thailand. After landing on the Malayan coast, the assault pushes down the peninsula towards the Johor Straits and Singapore, an important British base. Japanese forces land on Luzon Island in the Philippines. Japanese bombers sink the Royal Naval battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, sailing with no air cover. Combined with Pearl Harbor losses, this further destruction of capital ships not only completely alters the Pacific balance of sea power, but proves that even the most powerful service vessels are vulnerable to air attack. Although perhaps not realized at the time, both events mark the end of the battleship in war. Japanese forces invade Borneo. Japanese troops push through Hong Kong's mainland areas and invade Hong Kong Island. Wake Island in the Philippines falls after an heroic defense. Hong Kong surrenders. Japanese forces capture Manila, capital of the Philippines. U.S. forces, under General MacArthur, resist fiercely but are pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula. Japanese armies take Kuala Lumpur in Malaya, and with British and Commonwealth forces retreating before them, move towards Singapore. Advancing through Malaya, Japanese armies reach the Johor Straits and begin their assault on Singapore. This powerful British base was designed in the belief no military penetration of the Malayan jungles was possible and equipped with defences able only to resist attack from the sea. Even though their main concentration is against Germany, Churchill and Roosevelt dispatched troops to Fiji Islands and New Caledonia to prevent these islands being captured by the Japanese. Singapore, with its garrison of 60,000 men, surrenders to Japanese armies. This, the greatest capitulation in British history, does enormous damage to the UK's reputation throughout the region. Even though it was obvious an isolated Singapore could not hold out and was doomed, more British and Australian reinforcements have been dispatched, arriving in time only to surrender. By the end of March 1942, all Malaya will be under Japanese control, the Dutch East Indies seized, and Burma completely overrun. Flying from airfields in the newly captured Dutch East Indies, Japanese bombers attacked Darwin in northern Australia. Other than Java, all islands of the Dutch East Indies have fallen to Japanese attacks, and on the 27th of February, 2 massive invasion convoys are sighted heading towards that island. Under Dutch Admiral Dorman, a hastily assembled Dutch, US, and Royal and Australian naval group attempts to drive off a Japanese fleet whose air cover, heavy guns, and torpedoes are far superior to those possessed by US or British ships. In a running battle, 5 Allied naval vessels are sunk, while only 4 Japanese ships suffer damage. Japanese forces, their transport vessels unharmed, land on Java. In Burma, Japanese armies begin their assault on Rangoon. Rangoon falls to Japanese attack. British, Commonwealth and Chinese troops fall back through Burma to the Indian frontier, where they will establish a defensive line in the mountains. The spate of Japanese conquest now cuts the Far Eastern supply line to Russia, while all Allied shipping in the Indian and Pacific Oceans is threatened. Combined with Burma's occupation of this, denies China much outside aid. A powerful Japanese fleet penetrates into the Indian Ocean, seemingly intent on attacking India and Ceylon, but is deterred by a few fighter aircraft stationed in Ceylon. General MacArthur, stating prophetically, "I shall return," leaves the Philippines to take command of all Allied forces arriving in Australia on the 17th of March. U.S. forces in the Philippines surrender. In what is more a psychological than strategic blow, U.S. bombers under the command of General Doolittle attacked Japan's home island cities of Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya. Corregidor, a major U.S. stronghold, surrenders, thus ending all Allied resistance in the Western Pacific. U.S. naval forces intercept two Japanese fleets sailing to seize both Port Moresby in New Guinea as well as the Solomon Islands. This precipitates the greatest naval battle since Jutland, even though the fleets do not come into actual contact. All fighting is by air, and although both sides each lose an aircraft carrier, the USS Lexington is sunk, 19 Japanese warships are destroyed. Although this cannot be considered an outright victory, the battle prevents New Guinea falling into Japanese hands. With the intention of capturing Midway Island, a huge Japanese fleet comprising some 160 ships, 4 aircraft carriers, and carrying over 50,000 troops is mustered. Learning of the plan, massively outnumbered U.S. naval forces possessing only 3 aircraft carriers move secretly into position. Aided by land-based B-17 bombers, the U.S. Navy sinks all 4 Japanese carriers and shoots down 275 of their aircraft. In this one afternoon, Japanese naval supremacy ends, changing the balance of Pacific Sea power. Up to this moment, Japan has not lost a sea battle, but never again will it win one. From then on, its expansion eastwards is halted and vital sea routes threatened. This is a turning point of the Pacific War. The top-secret Manhattan Project begins in the USA, commissioned to develop atomic weapons. During the month, Japanese forces occupied the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kisku, dangerously close to the U.S. Alaskan mainland. Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands is attacked and seized by the Japanese. Japanese forces land in New Guinea, establishing a beachhead on its northeast coast before advancing along the Kokoda Track against fierce Allied resistance. If New Guinea falls, Australia and New Zealand will come under threat. U.S. forces retake the Aleutian island of Attu, while Japanese abandon neighboring Kiska. U.S. Marines land on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands and seize a vital airfield being constructed there by the Japanese. U.S. forces complete the Guadalcanal airfield and create an essential base. At Milne Bay, New Guinea, a Japanese attempt to land reinforcements is repulsed by Australian forces. massive Japanese attacks begin against US positions on Guadalcanal. US naval forces cause heavy Japanese losses as they attempt to land reinforcements on Guadalcanal. US sea control makes any further relief attempts impossible.
We're gonna have to slap the dirty little Jap, and Uncle Sam's the guy who can do it. We'll skin that streak of yellow from the sneaky little fella, and he'll think a cyclone struck him when we're through it.
Throughout the Pacific War Zone, Allied forces begin advancing. General MacArthur commences his island-hopping amphibious assaults on Japanese-held islands, while preparations are made to retake the Philippines and thus enable airstrikes against Japan's home islands. The painstaking conquest of Micronesian islands begins. During the year, the Allies announce they intend forcing Japan's unconditional surrender and strip it of all territories seized since 1895. US forces on Guadalcanal launch their final offensive. After 5 months of heavy fighting, Japanese troops abandoned Guadalcanal Island. This is the first major defeat to be suffered by Japanese land forces. Australian troops repulse overland Japanese attacks against Port Moresby. With New Guinea and Bismarck Archipelago secure, and thus northern Australia, Allied forces now turn towards the Philippines and eventually Okinawa. Admiral Nimitz commences his amphibious assault on the Gilbert and Solomon Islands with the intention of cutting Japanese supply lines. Their capture will provide forward bases for future island assaults, together with airfields within bombing range of Japan's home islands. Bougainville in the Solomon Islands is recaptured by US Marines. During a battle for the Gilbert Islands, Makin Island is taken easily, but the assault on Tarawa proves very costly, with 1,025 US troops killed and 2,257 wounded. Japanese losses are estimated at some 5,000. This is clear evidence of what clearing determined and well-prepared Japanese defenders can cost. The Allies announced their commitment to nothing less than total victory and complete disarmament of all Axis powers. By February, the Marshall Islands are retaken in face of fierce Japanese resistance that includes suicidal, banzai charges of men carrying explosives. The seizure of Eniwetok is particularly important in that it provides the Engebe Air Base that will enable US air control over a wide area. Ord Wingate, a charismatic British general who organized Chindit fighters behind Japanese lines in Burma, is killed in an air crash. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. A Japanese air attack on US naval forces in the Mariana Islands is mounted during clear weather that enables defending fighters to spot and shoot down a large number of aircraft. MacArthur begins reconquest of Philippines. US Marines land on Palau, Micronesia on the 15th of June and fight their way across the island. Offshore, the Battle of the Philippine Sea develops, with Japanese naval forces losing 476 planes and 3 carriers against 130 US aircraft, thus paving the way for reoccupation of the Philippines. Guam and Tinian Islands in the Marianas are taken. But the assault on Saipan proves very costly before it is finally taken on the 7th of July. The capture of these islands provides air bases within range of Japan's home islands, the first raids commencing on the 24th of September. A Japanese fleet attempting to prevent US landings on the Philippines is confronted in Leyte Gulf and over half of it destroyed. Japan's sea power is now finally crippled, and never again will it be able to mount a major sea battle. Leyte Gulf is the first battle in the Philippines campaign, opening the way for invasion of the Philippines, Okinawa, and possibly Japan itself. MacArthur's US forces land on the Philippines north of Manila and fight their way inland. Throughout the Japanese occupation, there has been continuing Filipino resistance. In China, Japanese forces attacked by the Chinese Red Army retreat back to the coast. Manila, capital of the Philippines, is liberated. Meeting at Yalta in the Russian Crimea, Allied leaders decide upon future war and peace policies that, although concentrating upon Europe, outline future Pacific intentions. In Burma, Japanese armies evacuate Mandalay. US Marines invade Iwo Jima in the Bonin archipelago, 750 miles south of Tokyo, where there is a large Japanese airbase from which attacks can be launched against Japan's home islands. The island's defences consist of interlinking tunnels and bunkers that are proof against even the heaviest naval bombardments and are the strongest so far encountered during the Pacific War. US Marines raise Old Glory on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi. During the fighting, they will suffer over 20,000 casualties with nearly 7,000 killed. Iwo Jima is finally taken and will become a major airbase for attacks on the Japanese homeland. By the war's end, it's estimated over 20,000 aircrew have been saved by being able to make emergency landings here. By the spring of 1945, Japanese forces were being defeated throughout the Pacific and Asian region, and even though resistance remained formidable, their eventual defeat and unconditional surrender were in little doubt. Even so, there were beliefs the Pacific War could drag on for months or years, and even as the European conflict entered its final weeks, with Germany near the point of collapse, plans were being made for the invasion of Japan. When war ended in Europe, there were few Allied servicemen who did not believe they would soon be fighting on the other side of the world. Yet two events, one top secret, the other glaringly public, would alter both the war's ending and the course of human history. In March, US scientists announced they had developed a nuclear bomb that worked, and in April, President Roosevelt died. The sudden death of US President Roosevelt on the 12th of April 1945 and succession of Harry S. Truman marked a dramatic turning point in the Second World War. Taking up office when the conflict was moving to its climax, many doubted Truman's ability to see the task through, believing he lacked Roosevelt's international vision and diplomatic skills. Germany had surrendered unconditionally on the 8th of May, but although there was bitter fighting almost to the very end, this could not compare with the ferocious and suicidal resistance of Japanese forces wherever they had been encountered. Theirs was a culture that would not lay down arms and accept unconditional surrender, but which believed dying in battle for the emperor was no more than natural honor and duty. This Japanese concept that death was preferable to dishonorable surrender was one reason why Allied prisoners of war were treated so dreadfully. Clear evidence of how costly would be an invasion of Japan was provided by heavy US losses suffered during the Iwo Jima campaign, when Japanese troops had fought to the last with suicidal fanaticism. If a small island could be so tenaciously defended and its assault cost so many lives, an invasion of Japan itself would be far more costly. Such real concerns increased during the US assault on Okinawa. Attacked by US forces on the 1st of April 1945, Okinawa was the only part of Japan's home territories to suffer seaborne assault, and its conquest would prove one of the costliest battles of the war. Like Iwo Jima, the island had been heavily fortified with underground bunkers and massive defense systems, of which the Machinato line of mountain fortresses was but one. Massive air attacks and naval bombardment failed either to dislodge or demoralize defenders, fighting becoming hand-to-hand often in face of mass Japanese suicide attacks. Ground had to be taken inch by inch, while in the air, kamikaze aircraft, packed with explosives and flown by suicide pilots, deliberately rammed US naval vessels, either sinking or putting them out of action. As a desperate measure, Japan threw its huge battleship, Yamato into the conflict only to have it sunk. Okinawa was relatively small, but it provided proof positive how costly an invasion of Japan's much large islands would be. It was not until the 22nd of June, after 2 months of bitter fighting, that Japanese resistance was finally overcome, but it cost 13,000 US lives and more than 100,000 of the enemy. Yet some hope appeared 7 days later on the 29th, when Emperor Hirohito expressed a desire to his ministers that peace should be sought. But this was no question of unconditional surrender, merely a seeking of advantageous terms. A massive bombing campaign against Japan's home islands had begun on November the 24th, 1944, from air bases on the recaptured Marianas, and by the 17th of May, Okinawa airfields were also operational. Attacks on Japanese cities would continue until the war's end. Tokyo being heavily bombed on July the 10th, when many of its wood and paper houses were burned and destroyed. Not only were its factories and docks being destroyed, but US submarines were sinking ships transporting materials essential for the country's survival and thus helping cripple its trade. Although the main effort against Japan came from the USA, and General MacArthur's island-hopping attacks on Japanese-occupied areas were a dramatic element of the Pacific War, the great contribution made by British and Commonwealth troops must not be overlooked. Hard fighting in New Guinea jungles had repulsed Japanese forces and possibly prevented an invasion of Australia and New Zealand. Australian forces had also invaded and recaptured Borneo. Especially bitter was the fighting in Burma, where British, American, Australian, Indian, and Chinese fought a hand-to-hand infantryman's campaign against 3 of Japan's best armies. By 1945, General Bill Slim's 14th Army, nicknamed the Forgotten, began the liberation of Southeast Asia, following up its decisive victory at Imphal by pushing Japanese forces back through Burma to the sea. A major factor in this campaign was the fighting behind enemy lines, much by Chindits, who was supplied by mule train and airdrop. By the 3rd of May, Rangoon was retaken, and 3 months later the whole of Burma would be declared liberated. For the 14th Army, this seemed to offer only a brief respite. Almost immediately, the USA made clear its intention of invading Japan, and all British and Commonwealth troops were placed under US command.
A few days before we reached Rangoon, we were within 27 miles when the British and Indian armies invaded by sea. There had been a message from the prisoners in Rangoon that the Japanese had left, and one Air Force officer believed them. They painted a message on the roof of the jail saying "extract digit, Japs gone, extract digit." Well, had they only said "Japs gone," they might have thought it was a trap. But having said extract digit, there was the sort of slang term of, get your finger out and get a job done. And so extract digit was known to be a slang. It only came from British sources. It didn't come from the Japanese. So this officer who was flying saw the painting on the roof of the jail, knew it was genuine, and he landed his aircraft to investigate. Meanwhile, the seaborne invasion of Rangoon, the south of Burma, took place.
Throughout the European conflict, even while Germany was operating its terrible concentration and extermination camps, prisoners of war were in the main treated correctly under the terms of the Geneva Convention. But the Japanese prison camp regime was one of ill treatment, starvation, working to death, beatings, and summary execution. There was certainly a Japanese attitude that surrender was dishonorable, and any true soldier would have fought to the death, but its treatment of prisoners was not that of a civilized society. Western prisoners of war found it hard to survive harsh physical labor in tropical conditions, even if they were being fed the full diet of rice and vegetables that were a Japanese soldier's normal ration, and usually they were not. To the Japanese, prisoners of war were regarded as a source of slave labor, and if they died, there were many more to take their place. Whatever excuses may be offered, Japan's atrocities still resound to its discredit. Scientist Albert Einstein had warned that Germany was attempting to develop a nuclear weapon, and it was obvious time was of the essence. It was not until the 17th of July 1945, when the bomb was tested over New Mexico, that its terrible power was revealed. That same month, a special commission proposed its employment against Japan as a means of preventing a very costly invasion, saving Allied lives and shortening the war. But the awesome nature of the weapon and the fact it would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese had to be considered. Henry Stimson, U.S. Secretary of War, did not want the bomb employed without prior warning and argued that Japan had first to be given the chance to surrender. Germany had already surrendered unconditionally, and at the Potsdam Conference on the 26th of July, Allied leaders, President Truman amongst them, agreed that Japan could do nothing less. By that time, it was being rumored that some new and dreadful weapon of war was available, and Japan would either have to surrender or face destruction. There would be no negotiation of terms, and it was made clear that, following capitulation, the country would be under military occupation, its armed forces disbanded, and a democratic government established. The problem was that Japan was still a vicious and militant warrior society, whose emperor was believed to be a linear descendant of the gods. Since unconditional surrender could destroy the very basis of the state, Japan's leaders decided not to surrender, but fight on. Preparations were now underway, and atomic weapons delivered to Tinian Island in the Marianas, ready for final attacks. All the while, normal bombing raids on Japan were continuing. The question remained whether the bomb should be used without warning or perhaps dropped on some remote region of Japan as evidence of what destruction it would cause. But this was still largely an experimental weapon and might fail. All the while, Japanese resistance was continuing strongly. Every day, more Allied soldiers were dying, and, as late as August the 12th, a US warship would be sunk by kamikaze attack. There is no doubt Japan would have fought on for several months, at the very least to the bitter end. It was to prevent further Allied loss of life, both to fighting men and prisoners of war, that President Truman authorized the bomb's employment. On August the 6th, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island to drop the first ever atomic weapon used in war on Hiroshima. Its huge airburst obliterating the city centre and killing some 80,000 of its people. Another 60,000 would die over the next 12 months. With no Japanese surrender immediately forthcoming, 3 days later, on the 9th, a second bomb used against Nagasaki killed a further 74,000. It had become obvious, even to the most determined Japanese leader, that no country could resist such weapons. The following day, on August the 10th, Japanese Emperor Hirohito held an imperial conference that declared all hostilities would end on the 14th of August, 1945. Even then, this was not totally unconditional, as President Truman agreed that Emperor Hirohito should remain as official head of state and not held guilty of any war crimes.
I think it was August the 6th. We were just sitting down to lunch and someone turned the radio on in the mess and they announced the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And of course a day or two later, Nagasaki. But that meant to us the war was over, and Truman gave us an excuse, a very justified excuse, we thought. He ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped because it saved Allied lives and shortened the war. And we thought it was as good a reason as any.
I have to say that I had serious misgiving about the justification for dropping the atomic bombs. Although it was wonderful to say that the war was over and we could think about going home, Whereas before that happened, we had a long, hard, costly struggle ahead of us, because this undoubtedly would have been serious loss of lives, which was prevented, a serious loss of lives, Allied lives, American and British. It seemed to me to be a terrible weapon to have used. And I kind of realised, perhaps not totally, the implications, the moral implications of the use of a weapon of that nature. But it was serious enough in my mind at the time to wonder whether it was justified, because by then we were winning. I just felt that we are winning, more lives will be lost, but should we have used that terrible weapon, even in the Japanese, who I say I have no sympathy for the Japanese generally, they were acting in such barbaric ways, and when we liberated the British prisoners of war who had been in their hands for years, and almost all of them had been for years, and most of the prisoners were taken in Singapore, and when we saw how they had been treating the prisoners, we felt even more justified, you know, and whatever happened to Japanese, it didn't matter too much. But I still felt some misgiving about it.
At that time, it was a sort of relief to us, because we were not really winning the war on the east. I mean, we were pitched against them. We were day and night. We were having our casualties, and after the very first bomb, or probably it was after the second bomb, we got the news that they surrendered. So it was a very great relief. I mean, we didn't think anything bad about it. We thought, well, that was a savior, that is really helped to end the war. And probably otherwise it may not have ended for many, many more years.
I don't think at the time we realised the full implications of what a nuclear bomb meant. It was, at that time, it was a sense of hope that that would bring the war finally to an end, and the humanitarian result of it was not really conceived.
I felt that something had to be done to end the war, but I don't really think, on reflection, that had I been in a situation to have to make a decision to drop an atomic bomb that would affect, as it did, so many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, and the devastation that it caused, that I would have made that decision. I think I would have waited for the war to, if possible, to come to a reasonable fruition without having to resort to what I felt at the time were such extreme circumstances. But in defence of that, I would say that what I've heard of the treatment of British POWs by the Japanese, then they deserved all they got.
General MacArthur will accept Japan's formal surrender on the 2nd of September 1945 on board USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
It is my earnest hope
and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. These proceedings are closed.
At Rangoon, 10 days later, Lord Louis Mountbatten receives the surrender of all Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. 5 months after the European conflict ended, the Second World War was over. Some 110 million combatants had taken part in World War II. Fighting in Europe and Asia killed some 27 million men, of whom Russia's losses alone amounted to almost half. 4 million German soldiers died, 6 million Chinese, and over 1 million Japanese, while the USA, Britain, and its Commonwealth suffered a combined 750,000 casualties. Civilian losses were enormous to the point of being incalculable, but rough estimates suggest these were in the order of 20 to 30 million lives. After days of speculation and rumor, President Truman announces Japan's surrender at 7 p.m. on the 14th of August from the Oval Office in the White House, Washington, D.C.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
As news spread that the next day is to be Victory over Japan Day, all over the USA, millions of people throng the streets of towns and cities, large and small. In New York, once again, Times Square is a throng of celebrating people, overjoyed that the war is now finally over. Many attend church services in remembrance of the many that will not return. In San Francisco, the U.S. Navy, which has played a huge part in the defeat of Japan, celebrates long and hard.
There'll be a jubilee. There'll be a jubilee. There'll be a jubilee upon that happy day. Sister, you're a man and my man too. You're a man and my man too. You're a man and my man too. We'll be coming home to stay. Great day in the morning when the peaceful sun will be dawning. Oh, say what a gay time, for the night will seem just like daytime. Mister, there'll be a jubilee, happiness for you and me. There'll be a jubilee upon that happy day.
Shipyard workers take the day off as many whistles and hooters are set off. China, whose people have suffered long years of Japanese invasion and oppression, the traditional ways of festive celebration are seen in many of the cities.
Mary got on the phone to her mother's to let her know where we were going. We decided on the spur of the moment, I think, to go down to London.
Huge crowds reminiscent of VE Day flocked to see King George V and the Queen drive down the Mall from Buckingham Palace in the rain. And then waved to the crowds from the balcony, the young princesses later mingling with the crowds of revelers.
To Buckingham Palace and amongst the crowd and watched the royal family come out on the balcony and wave to everybody.
We all love you, Sergeant Major, when we hear you bawling shower-lay. Don't forget to wake me in the morning and bring me round a nice hot cup of tea.
We were standing on an island waiting to cross the road, and there was some cars coming down the road, and in one was Winston Churchill, and he passed by us. I could have reached out and touched him. So that was a moment to remember, the great Winston Churchill.
And people all over the country crowd together to sing, dance and carouse.
Everybody was everybody's friend, I think, at that time.
VJ Day, we were in Chichester. Now, Chichester was a different story, different cup of tea from Bournemouth, as I enumerated before. Chichester became alive. Everybody danced, everybody sang. Everybody was matey with everybody else. Everybody did the conga around the square. It was absolutely fantastic. You felt the war was over. This was something that we all wanted. And it was, I don't know what the expression would be, but it was more than just a relief. There was a freedom of yourself somewhere. I find this difficult to describe. I don't know how. But I'm sure I've given you the impression when I say that Chichester was alive, in contrast to Bournemouth that was dead.
And as far as celebrating, there was no alcohol in the field. We don't have any bars in the British Army or anything like that. So we celebrate by making as much noise. We're cheering and setting off hand grenades, tracer bullets, and anything you care to make a noise and cheer, we did. Of course, naturally, in a few days' time, when we got to a suitable bar, we celebrated in a traditional manner.
Rangoon, now again under British control, many of the inhabitants are overjoyed at the departure of the Japanese. as yet few will realize that their days of empire are numbered.
And the troops started up north and met us, as I say, 27 miles north of Rangoon, and that's where I was when the Japanese announced their surrender. The emperor decided that they had enough and surrendered. And at that time, our orders were that there's a ceasefire, but we are authorized to fire in defense, but not in offense. And some Japanese units either didn't know or didn't want to know about surrender. And there were some Japanese units which went on fighting for some days after the official ceasefire and surrender. On VJ Day, we went mad, but we were not in a situation where it was possible to have celebrations in a conventional way. There were supplies of rum available, but for alcohol, I happened to be teetotal, so I didn't use mine. But other than that, we got some extra rations and parties of a kind. But we were in the jungle and in combat situation. We weren't in a town or a city, or in a place where there were buildings even and tables and chairs to sit down and have a meal and at a table and chairs or anything of the kind. I mean, everything was very makeshift. We were still in combat situation for weeks after that, so we didn't have anything of what one might call a normal celebration. I mean, obviously everybody was over the moon and with joy. Repatriation was brought down from 5 years to 3.5 years. Initially, a tour of duty in the Far East was maximum 5 years, so that when a soldier had served 5 years, he was entitled to come back to the United Kingdom, and that was reduced to 3.5 years. So of course that was great news as well. It helped me. I qualified when it came down to 3.5 years. I qualified to come home.
I was posted to Royal Naval Air Station at Katakaranda in what was then Ceylon, and I was commanding officer of a squadron that was working up there, that 824 squadron. The idea was that when the squadron was worked up, it would then move on to Australia and the Japanese campaign. But the war ended, VJ occurred while we were still in Ceylon. So my memories of VJ Day were that I led the naval fly-past Lord Mountbatten and Colombo, and we had celebrations, of course, in Colombo and in Katakaranda.
All over Eastern Asia, formerly under Japanese sway, Allied prisoners of war are released and enjoy again pleasures that they missed for so long. Emperor Hirohito of Japan broadcasts to a defeated and demoralized nation, saying that Japan has been defeated by a new and most cruel bomb used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many people later are to commit harikiri in front of his palace in despair and shame, having been told by their emperor that they would have to endure the unendurable.
There was a general relief. Everybody was happy. The civilians were as happy as others, but it was mostly the people in the uniforms who were affected. And we were very happy. There were big celebrations, there were parties, there were dinners, there were, for at least a week after BJ, people were going about feeling really relieved and free.
The Philippines have suffered more than most from the Japanese occupation, and their relief and joy is overwhelming. It will take many years before the truth of the oppressive occupation is to become known, with lawsuits from women forced into sex slavery in Japanese comfort stations being filed. Yet some Filipinos will remember the Japanese occupation as a time when order was imposed on these turbulent islands. Peace at last has come after 6 long years of brutal war, but the world is changed forever, with a new and terrible force being unleashed against mankind in the form of the atom bomb, which during the decades to come will increase in power. Japan gives up its right to declare war or muster an army, and is ironically to become America's principal ally in the battle against communism in the Far East. Henceforth, it will become a democratic model of prosperity to lure other nations away from the temptations of totalitarianism. America, however, has further battles to wage in Southeast Asia that are as yet unenvisaged. But for a brief moment, the world appears to be at peace.